All right, guys, so I'm going to try something new. As you can see me this time. You're welcome. So we'll see how this works. If you prefer these videos where you can actually see me, not just hear me, is that better, more beneficial, along with the slide? Up to you. You guys tell me. If it's more distracting and you'd rather just listen, then feel free to let me know. And if a lot of people say that they'd rather not have it this way, then I'll stop doing it like this. If people would prefer it like this, then I'll keep doing it. But it's looking like we're going to be doing this for the rest of the semester. So I figured I would try something new. So we're going to keep going with period 8 in this video, and we're starting with chapter 37. So where I ended in your last video was after Kennedy's assassination. I hope you enjoyed the depths of the dark web investigating his death and who you think did it. But now we're going to be moving on to Johnson's presidency. Definitely one of the most interesting presidents we've ever had in American history, Lyndon Johnson for sure. So if you remember, I mentioned at the end of that video, and we were talking about at the end of chapter 37, when they used Kennedy's death and the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church and the entire March on Washington and the success of the Civil Rights Movement to push for the Civil Rights Act of 1964. When Johnson got into office at the end of 1963, that opened up a lot of questions. I mentioned, well, is this something Johnson's going to support? Will he support the Civil Rights Movement the same way that Kennedy did? Because Kennedy was the most supportive president of civil rights, that we've ever had, aside from Lincoln up to that point. So it left a lot of questions open. But Johnson was definitely like an old school Democrat. It didn't really matter that he came from Texas, a southern state. He definitely was supportive of a majority of the Democratic ideals, and we'll get more into his platform and his agenda in a minute. But he did, to an extent, support civil rights. He wasn't necessarily, like a big social change activist. He wasn't quite as like bright-eyed and as Kennedy, looking for like rainbows in a utopia and I have a dream where we all get along type of stuff. But he did support, like I said, civil rights change and legislation to an extent. We see that several times during his presidency. But he did support the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and he did sign it into law. So, and that's not the only piece of civil rights legislation he'll pass. Like I said, he'll institute affirmative action right at the beginning of his presidency. Affirmative action, you've probably heard of it before. It basically has to do with trying to level the playing field in jobs and in college admissions and things like that. Basically institutes procedures in place to where someone's not being hired, fired, admitted, denied based on their race or issues like that. So what it is not, it is not quotas. A lot of people think that it means like, oh, we have to have this many black people that work for us, this many Latino people that work for us, this many whatever. That's not how affirmative action works. Like I said, it's a lot more complicated than that, a lot more nuanced, and it's like I said, a system of policies and procedures to make sure that race is not a factor in those types of admissions or hirings or whatever, to make sure that there's like an even playing field. There are plenty of people across the country that didn't like affirmative action, don't like affirmative action now. There's still a lot of debate as to whether or not it really works, and honestly the answer is it works to an extent. Does it solve the problems? Absolutely not. Nothing like a government piece of legislation is ever going to solve, like a societal or cultural idea or problem. That's going to take generations. But aside from affirmative action and the Civil Rights Act, really what all of Johnson's policies and agenda is going to be wrapped up in something that he called the Great Society. And this is really what got what he really started to bring forward as his platform when he ran for president in 1964. So remember, 1964 was supposed to be an election year, and the Democrats were all ready to go gung ho with John Kennedy as a re-election candidate, but he was assassinated, and so Johnson became president, and ultimately they were like, well, we got to roll with this, we got to roll with the punches here. Johnson has to be our nominee. So Johnson was nominated, and it was all very quick. I know that you think like, oh, well, how long does it take to prepare for an election? The second you get elected, you're working on your reelection campaign. So really, they had been working on Kennedy's reelection campaign for already 3 years. So having to shift really quickly to trying to, give Johnson an election for the first time was definitely a difficult task. And Republicans had nominated to go against him a senator from Arizona, Barry Goldwater, who's definitely going to be the face of like a newer generation of Republican. Where this is, a lot of people always ask, like, when do the parties switch? The parties don't switch, their voting block switch, and some of their their fundamental ideals don't necessarily change, but some of their, in terms of like republicanism versus liberalism, but some of their the way that they put that into practice, some of their agendas and stuff, that will ultimately change. So what Barry Goldwater is he was sort of ushering in this like new wave of conservatives that we were seeing begin to grow in a lot of these more suburban areas, especially in the Sun Belt. He's really going to try and go after those more like white suburban voters. Fun fact. Ronald Reagan, the way that he got involved in the Republican Party, period, is he campaigned for Barry Goldwater. Hillary Clinton worked on the Barry Goldwater campaign when she was in college in 1964. That was how she got her start in politics. So she wasn't always a Democrat. She started as a Republican. Whatever gets you elected, I guess, or not elected in Hillary's case. Sorry, girl. But nevertheless, it was a lot of debate about, is Johnson the right person to lead us through this period of a lot of social change? We knew that we were in a very tumultuous time, and Barry Goldwater really tried to hammer in on a lot of the policies that Johnson had been saying he was going to support and move for in his Great Society platform. And I'll get more into that in a minute. But in the end, obviously, you don't know anything about a President Goldwater, so Johnson ended up winning, and he went forward with his Great Society plan. Now, there are a lot of different aspects to the Great Society. The Great Society was basically, exactly like what it sounds. He wants to create this, like, utopia, so to speak, and it was a broad platform, including increasing spending and social programs on, poverty and education and transportation and anything and everything, jobs, the economy. He wants to focus on all of it. It was definitely like, we're going to improve life in the United States in every capacity. That was essentially what the Great Society was, the purpose of it. And there were a lot, like I said, a lot of different facets and aspects to the Great Society, but the biggest piece, and definitely the one that he cared most about, wasn't civil rights, but was actually the war on poverty. At this point in time, we still had a large portion of Americans living below the poverty line, even more than we do today. And Johnson's sort of, cross to bear was that he wanted to end poverty in the United States, or at least reduce it. So he established, or called out a war on poverty. That he was going to end poverty in the United States. And he instituted a lot of different things that fell into the war on poverty. One, he established the Office of Economic Opportunity. They would, dump millions of dollars into these offices of economic opportunity in local areas, and they would use those to sponsor social programs in their area, whether that meant like jobs training, education funding, whatever. The war on poverty also gave us Medicare and Medicaid. Medicare is health insurance, essentially health insurance for the elderly, and Medicaid is health insurance and there are different platforms and levels to all of these, but health insurance for people in poverty. So both of these things we still use today and are still in place. Both of those come from the War on Poverty and from President Johnson. He'll also start Head Start. If you've ever heard of Head Start or been in Head Start when you were little or knew someone who was, Head Start is a child care program. It was originally designed to basically be a child care facility with a real curriculum, especially pre-K. If you went to pre-K when you were young, pre-K centers are very expensive. Childcare is extremely expensive, and finding a daycare center with a curriculum that actually teaches children something, those daycare centers are very pricey, and they have wait lists, and it's hard to get into, and there's definitely some big racial and economic disparities there. So having a program like Head Start, a government-funded daycare facility that provides an actual curriculum to children in, low income communities. Now you don't necessarily have to be low income to go to Head Start, but it is, I'm pretty sure, free if you're low income. But he'll start Head Start, which, like I said, program we still use today. He'll also establish the DOT, the Department of Transportation, that Department of Housing and Urban Development, to try to improve housing conditions across the country, as well as he's going to start PBS, the public broadcasting station, which is going to provide, basically, like, if you've never watched PBS, which sad for your childhood if you never watched any of the kids shows on PBS when you were growing up. But all of that is government funded or funded from viewers like you. If you remember those commercials where they would say, like, go get your parent and bring them out here. And it was, the telethons where they would call to get supporters, because PBS is not, funded by commercials and, private businesses that pay for ads and things like that, and they're not, a large for-profit network like, CBS or ABC. They are government funded and funded on donations news organization that provides, public broadcasting. NPR is essentially the same thing, but in radio.